Coordinator Rebecca Webb had been warned about Instructor Keith before she even stepped aboard Station Tertius. 3 different human colleagues had pulled her aside during her transfer briefing, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to grimly amused. "He's going to hate you," Lieutenant Marcus Rivera had said. "Not you specifically, just the fact that you're human." Rebecca had nodded, filing the information away with all the other cultural briefings she'd absorbed over the past 3 months. The Tertiary Cooperation Zone was humanity's first major posting in deep Federation space, and friction was inevitable. She'd dealt with prejudice before. What she hadn't expected was how theatrical it would be. The training module was a massive cylinder, easily 40 meters across, rotating slowly to provide the illusion of orientation without actual gravity. 23 trainees floated in various states of discomfort, their bodies adapted to everything from methane atmospheres to crystalline gravity wells. Rebecca drifted near the back, one hand loosely gripping a safety rail while her inner ear negotiated with her brain about which direction qualified as up. Instructor Keith dominated the center of the space. 6 limbs, no skeletal structure, and an air of absolute confidence that came from 4 billion years of evolutionary superiority. The Vexil had evolved in shattered asteroid belts where gravity was negotiable and momentum was law. He moved through zero gravity like water flowing downhill, effortless, natural, perfect. His membrane rippled in what the translator rendered as laughter. "Let me be clear about something," Keith announced, his chemical signals flattening into institutional galactic standard. "This certification is mandatory for all personnel assigned to Station Tertius, regardless of your limitations." Rebecca watched several trainees exchange glances. A HFY, built like a segmented eel with delicate manipulator fronds, coiled slightly in what might have been amusement. "Some species," Keith continued, gesturing at the open chamber, "evolved in environments where 3-dimensional movement is instinctive. Others developed sensory organs specifically calibrated for void work." He paused, letting 2 of his eye stalks swivel toward Rebecca. "And some evolved to lumber across planetary surfaces, clinging to the ground like parasites to a host." The CHVN definitely laughed at that. So did a Pinth, though their laughter sounded like grinding metal. Rebecca said nothing. She'd learned quickly that responding to casual xenophobia only encouraged it. Her dark eyes tracked Keith's movement, her expression carefully neutral. "Gravity-dependent vertebrates," Keith announced as if diagnosing a terminal disease, "suffer from a peculiar evolutionary blind spot. Their brains developed to navigate essentially 2 dimensions, forward, backward, left, right. Up and down were fixed constants, not variables." His membranes darkened with what might have been satisfaction. "This makes them profoundly unsuited to void work." "Is there a point to this?" The voice came from a Feltic, a species resembling an ambulatory fern with too many opinions. "Or are we here to pass a certification?" "The point," Keith said smoothly, "is managing expectations. Some of you will find this training intuitive, others will struggle." Another pointed glance at Rebecca. "And some may not pass at all. There's no shame in recognizing one's biological limitations." Rebecca's grip on the rail shifted slightly. She could feel the weight of assumptions settling over her like a familiar coat, heavy, uncomfortable but not unexpected. Keith wanted her to fail. That much was obvious. What he didn't know was how often she'd heard that before. Question. Keith's membrane stiffened at Rebecca's voice. "Humans and their questions. Yes." "The safety rails." Rebecca gestured at the grid pattern running throughout the module. "They're positioned evenly throughout the space. How many species require them?" Keith's translator hesitated, parsing the chemical complexity of his response. "Approximately 60% of registered Federation species experience some disorientation in zero-gravity environments during initial exposure. And after training, most adapt adequately for basic station work." Keith's tone carried an edge of impatience. Why? Just trying to understand the baseline. Rebecca's expression remained neutral. You've mentioned humans are particularly unsuited for this. I'm wondering what the comparison data looks like. Quinn, who resembled an ambulatory crystal formation, made a sound like wind chimes colliding. She's got you there, instructor. I've seen the statistics. Humans test below average for initial zero-gravity adaptation, but the variance is within standard deviation of 40 other species. Keith's membranes flushed darker. The Terran physiology has specific vulnerabilities. Their cardiovascular system, for instance, developed to fight constant gravitational pressure. In zero gravity, blood pools incorrectly, causing cognitive impairment, nausea, disorientation. Motion sickness, Rebecca supplied calmly. We call it space adaptation syndrome. Affects about 70% of first-time astronauts. Usually resolves within 72 hours. 70%, Keith repeated as if the number proved his point. The nausea is unpleasant, not debilitating. We have medications. Rebecca's tone remained conversational, and the disorientation resolves with exposure. And the panic responses documented in early Terran space programs. We got better. The HFY uncoiled slightly. I've heard stories about human void work. Most involve extensive tethering, rigid protocols, frequent emergency retrievals. Early days, Rebecca acknowledged. We've been in space for 3 centuries now. We've had time to practice. 3 centuries. Keith's translator added layers of condescension. My species has navigated the void for 18,000 years. Your entire spacefaring history is a rounding error. That's fair, Rebecca said quietly. She still hadn't let go of the rail. Keith's membranes rippled with satisfaction. Let me demonstrate proper zero-gravity movement. Observe how I use momentum transfer, rotational control, and spatial awareness to navigate without wasted energy or trajectory drift. He released his anchor point and moved through the chamber like liquid geometry. 6 limbs extended and contracted in perfect sequence, each movement calculated to produce exact rotational adjustments. He touched a far wall with 2 limbs, absorbed the momentum, and redirected himself back toward the group without spinning, without drifting, without apparent effort. It was objectively impressive. This is the standard you should aspire to, Keith announced, settling back into position. Economy of movement, predictive trajectory calculation, complete spatial awareness. He paused deliberately. Now, Coordinator Webb, would you like to attempt a simple translation from your current position to the far marker? Rebecca looked at the marker, a glowing point about 20 meters away across open space. The distance wasn't significant. The implication was. I can try, she said. There's no penalty for declining, Keith assured her, his tone dripping with false encouragement. Many gravity-adapted species find the first few attempts overwhelming. Rebecca released the rail. For a moment she hung in space, motionless, her body slightly curled in a way that made her look smaller than she was. The other trainees watched with varying degrees of interest and anticipation. The HFY coiled tighter, ready to enjoy the show. Then Rebecca moved her left hand in a small, precise gesture near her hip. Her body began to rotate slowly along her vertical axis. She brought her knees up, tucked slightly, and the rotation accelerated. 1 full rotation. She extended her legs at exactly the right moment, and the angular momentum translated into forward motion. She drifted toward the marker, spinning slowly, her body relaxed. Halfway there, she extended one arm. Her fingers caught a passing rail, barely, just enough contact to adjust her trajectory by perhaps 5 degrees. The touch was so light it barely slowed her rotation. She reached the marker, extended both arms, absorbed her momentum against the wall, and settled into a stable position. No flailing, no panic, no wasted movement. The chamber was very quiet. Rebecca looked back at Keith. Like that. The instructor's membranes had gone completely still. The certification course occupied a separate module, larger, more complex, and thoroughly uninterested in making anyone comfortable. Obstacle course hardly covered it. The chamber was a three-dimensional maze of floating platforms, narrow corridors, and deliberately placed interference fields that would shove you sideways if your trajectory wasn't perfect. Handholds existed, but they were spaced far enough apart that relying on them would triple your completion time. The objective was simple: navigate from entrance to exit portal without contacting any of the marked red surfaces. Touch one, and you failed. 20 minutes per attempt, 3 tries maximum. The Celtic went first, using their multiple frond appendages to grip and release in rapid succession. Competent, unremarkable, they finished in 18 minutes with 2 minor trajectory corrections. The Pinth took 14 minutes but had to restart twice after brushing marked surfaces. Their crystalline structure made momentum absorption difficult. Every contact risked a violation. Keith observed from a monitoring station, his limbs manipulating holographic displays that tracked each trainee's performance. His commentary had become noticeably less frequent after Rebecca's earlier demonstration, but he still provided technical notes, corrections, suggestions. Professional, detached, only slightly bitter. "Coordinator Webb," he announced, "you're next." Rebecca pushed off from the waiting area with that same gentle, economical movement. She paused at the entrance, her head tilting as she examined the course layout. Her eyes tracked paths that didn't exist yet, calculating angles that hadn't formed. "Whenever you're ready," Keith said. "The timer begins when you cross the threshold." Rebecca nodded once, then launched. What happened next made the Quinn drop their data stylus. She entered the course in a tight spin, her body tucked and rotating along her longitudinal axis. As she approached the first platform cluster, she extended her right arm, just her arm, and the resulting asymmetry killed her spin while redirecting her path 30 degrees upward. She missed the platform by centimeters, threading between 2 marked surfaces without slowing. "Rotation for correction," the Quinn muttered. "That's not standard technique." The HFY coiled near the monitoring station made a sound like escaping steam. "Look at her trajectory calculation. She's not moving in straight lines." They were right. Rebecca's path through the course was curved, flowing, each movement bleeding into the next like choreography. Where other species moved in linear jumps, push, drift, grab, redirect, Rebecca spiraled. She used her spine as a pivot point, her limbs as control surfaces, creating complex three-dimensional arcs that somehow required fewer course corrections than anyone else's methodical straight-line approach. She reached a narrow corridor section that had forced the Pinth to restart twice. The space was barely wider than her shoulders, with marked surfaces on all sides. Rebecca entered it perpendicular, her body rotating slowly, threading through like a screw through wood. When she emerged, she'd gained momentum instead of losing it. "How is she doing that?" The Celtic's translator carried genuine confusion. "She's accelerating without push-off points." Keith's membranes had flushed that dark color again. "She's using rotational energy transfer. It's inefficient." "It's working," the Quinn countered. Rebecca approached the final section, a series of floating rings that required precise navigation. Most trainees went through them one at a time, carefully adjusting trajectory for each ring. Rebecca pulled her knees to her chest, began rotating on multiple axes simultaneously, and slipped through all 5 rings in one continuous corkscrew motion without touching a single surface. She crossed the exit threshold and caught the stopping bar with one hand, absorbing her momentum so smoothly it looked rehearsed. 9 minutes 43 seconds, the monitoring station announced. 0 violations. The chamber was silent, except for the ambient hum of life support systems. Rebecca oriented herself toward Keith, waiting. The instructor checked his displays 3 times, as if the numbers might change. "That was irregular," he said finally. "Did I pass?" "You didn't touch any marked surfaces. Your time is acceptable." He paused, his translator adding weight to each word. "Your technique is highly unorthodox, but effective." Keith's membranes rippled in a pattern Rebecca couldn't interpret. "Yes, effective." Quinn drifted closer to the course entrance, their crystalline structure refracting the chamber's light in thoughtful patterns. "Coordinator, I need to ask, where did you learn to move like that?" Rebecca considered the question. "Which part?" "The rotational control, the multi-axis spin, the way you used your center of mass as a variable instead of a fixed point." The Quinn's translator crackled with academic excitement. "That's not in any Federation zero-gravity manual." "No," Rebecca agreed, "it's not." "So where?" the HFY pressed. "Advanced military training, specialist void work programs." Rebecca's expression suggested she was trying to figure out how to explain something obvious. "I did gymnastics when I was 7, diving team in secondary school, some recreational climbing." She shrugged, and even that movement in zero gravity looked intentional. "Picked up aerial silks as an adult. Decent exercise." The trainees exchanged looks that transcended species barriers. The universal expression of people who suspect they're being mocked, but can't prove it. "Gymnastics," Keith repeated slowly. "A gravity-based recreational activity." "Most of our recreation is gravity-based," Rebecca said. "We have a lot of gravity." "And this teaches zero-gravity navigation how, exactly?" Rebecca pushed off gently, floating into a position where everyone could see her. "Gymnastics teaches body awareness, momentum control, and rotation in 3 dimensions. Diving teaches you to track orientation while falling and enter new mediums at precise angles. Climbing builds spatial reasoning and movement efficiency." She demonstrated a slow rotation, her arms extending and contracting to control her spin. "Aerial work teaches you to move when you can't touch the ground, using your body as the primary tool." The Celtic's fronds quivered. "But those activities all occur in gravity. The principles shouldn't transfer." "They transfer better than you'd think," Rebecca said. "Gravity makes everything harder. Take it away and suddenly all that training is just easier to execute." "That's absurd," Keith said flatly. "Gravity is a fundamental constant. Training in its presence can't possibly prepare you for its absence. The physics are completely different." "Are they?" The Quinn had pulled up something on their display. "Actually, instructor, I'm seeing some interesting parallels. Rotational dynamics remain consistent regardless of gravitational presence. Conservation of angular momentum, action-reaction principles, spatial geometry, these don't change. Gravity just adds an extra force vector." "An enormous force vector," Keith countered. "Or makes them more challenging," the Quinn said quietly. "If you can control a spinning motion while gravity is pulling you toward a surface at 9.8 meters per second squared, doing it in zero gravity is trivially simple by comparison." The HFY uncoiled slightly. "Wait, are you suggesting humans train for zero gravity by making everything deliberately more difficult?" "We don't train for zero gravity," Rebecca corrected. "We just play. The difficulty is built into the environment we play in." Keith's eye stalks converged on Rebecca with something approaching suspicion. "These activities you mentioned, gymnastics, diving, climbing, how common are they among your species?" "Common enough. Most population centers have facilities. Plenty of people do them recreationally." "Define plenty." Rebecca thought about it. "Globally, hundreds of millions participate in at least one of those activities, though the numbers vary by region and economic factors." "Hundreds of millions," the Celtic repeated, "as recreation." "We get bored easily," Rebecca said, "and we don't like sitting still." The Quinn was scrolling rapidly through their display now, their crystalline structure flickering with reflected light from the data. Instructor, I think we need to look at Terran recreational activities more comprehensively. This might be more significant than an isolated training quirk. It's not significant, Keith said, but his membrane coloration suggested uncertainty. It's a coincidence. Humans may have accidentally developed some movement patterns that happen to translate to zero gravity, but that doesn't indicate actual competency. His translator paused, adding weight to the next words. The coordinator passed the course. Congratulations. That doesn't change the fundamental biological limitations of her species. Rebecca smiled that small smile again. Of course not, instructor. But the Quinn was already pulling up video files, their translator humming with academic fascination. Oh no. Oh, this is remarkable. Keith, you need to see this. The common area wasn't designed for philosophical crisis, but it was hosting one anyway. 6 trainees had clustered around the Quinn's data pad, watching with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for documentaries about predator species. On the screen, a human launched themselves off a cliff wearing fabric wings, carving through air currents at speeds that would be fatal upon impact with anything solid. This is suicide, the HFY whispered. Why isn't anyone stopping them? It's a sport, Rebecca said from her position near the beverage dispenser. Wingsuit flying, relatively safe if you know what you're doing. Relatively safe, the Celtic repeated. They're falling from altitude with no propulsion system. They're not falling, they're flying. There's a difference. The Quinn swiped to another file. This one showed humans on wheeled boards, launching themselves down handrails and concrete stairs, their bodies contorting midair to land on narrow surfaces. Half the clips ended with impacts that looked catastrophic. And this, Keith's voice was tight, this is also recreation. Skateboarding, been around for centuries. Kids do it in parking structures. Children, the Pinth said, their crystalline structure vibrating with distress. You let your juveniles practice high-velocity collision sports. Rebecca shrugged. We supervise mostly. The Quinn kept scrolling, their academic composure cracking with each new file. Humans diving from platforms into water, 10 meters, 20 meters, heights that would shatter most species' structural integrity. Humans swinging between buildings on ropes, trusting their grip strength and trajectory calculation. Humans in caves, climbing vertical rock faces with only their fingers and specialized footwear for purchase. This one is labeled free soloing, the Quinn said weakly. That translates to climbing without safety equipment at terminal velocity heights. It's controversial, Rebecca admitted. Most climbers use ropes. Most, Keith echoed, not all. Some people like the challenge. The Celtic's fronds had gone completely rigid. Your species has death drives. That's the only explanation. You're collectively suicidal. We're not suicidal, we're just, Rebecca paused, searching for the right word. Competitive with ourselves mostly, we like testing limits. By throwing yourselves off cliffs. By learning how far we can push before something breaks. Usually we stop before the breaking part. Usually, the HFY repeated, horrified. The Quinn pulled up a new file, this one from something called the Summer Olympics. Humans in a pool, launching themselves from springboards, rotating multiple times along multiple axes, entering the water at angles so precise the splash was minimal. The scoring system measured perfection in fractions of points. They're competing, the Quinn said slowly, to see who can fall into water most elegantly. Diving is an art form, Rebecca said. Also a science. You have to calculate rotation speed, body position, entry angle, all while moving through 3 dimensions. Judges deduct points for poor form or splash. Keith had moved closer to the screen, his eye stalks focused with unwilling fascination. These rotations, the axis control, this is what you meant by gymnastics teaching spatial awareness. Part of it, Gymnasts work on different apparatus, bars, beams, floor routines. All of it requires knowing exactly where your body is in space, even when you're inverted or spinning. Another file appeared. Humans on fabric suspended from ceilings, wrapping themselves in intricate patterns, dropping into controlled falls, catching themselves at the last possible moment. The movements were fluid, almost dance-like, but the underlying physics were brutally unforgiving. Aerial silks, Rebecca supplied. What I mentioned earlier. You use the fabric for grip and friction control, but most of the work is core strength and spatial reasoning. If you lose track of your orientation, you fall. Onto ground, the pynth said, as if the concept was newly horrifying. You train in an environment where mistakes are punished by planetary impact. Makes you very motivated to not make mistakes. The HFY had coiled into the tightest configuration anyone had seen. Let me understand this correctly. Your species, gravity-dependent, fragile, prone to broken skeletal structures, invented recreational activities that simulate the conditions of void work, but made them significantly more dangerous by adding gravitational acceleration. We didn't invent them for void work, Rebecca said patiently. We invented them because they're fun. The void work application is incidental. Fun, Keith said. The word came out strangled. You find controlled falling fun. Humans have been jumping off things since before we had written language, Rebecca explained. We climbed trees, dove into rivers, swung from vines. When we ran out of natural features to launch ourselves from, we built artificial ones. Then we invented machines to take us higher so we could fall farther. She paused. Then we went to space and discovered we'd accidentally been training for it the whole time. The common area had gone quiet except for the soft audio from the data pad. A human commentator describing a parkour routine with the same technical precision Keith used for zero-gravity instruction. The Quinn's translator made a sound like shattering crystal. I need to correct something I said earlier, instructor. This isn't remarkable. This is terrifying. Why terrifying? Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. Because you're telling us this is normal, the Quinn said. That hundreds of millions of humans engage in activities that simulate void conditions. Rotation, free fall, momentum transfer, spatial disorientation. Inside a gravity well that makes every mistake potentially lethal. And you do this voluntarily, for enjoyment. When you phrase it like that, it sounds excessive. How would you phrase it? Rebecca considered. We got bored on the ground. We'd already figured out walking, running, basic survival. So we started asking questions. How high can I climb? How far can I jump? How fast can I go? What happens if I spin while falling? Can I control it? She gestured at the screen, where a human was executing a complex aerial maneuver on a snowboard. Every one of these activities is someone answering a question about what their body can do in three-dimensional space, under the cruelest teacher imaginable. Gravity, the Quinn said quietly. Gravity, Rebecca confirmed. It never forgives mistakes. It never gets tired. It never gives second chances. So we learn to respect it, understand it, and occasionally negotiate with it. When you spend your whole evolutionary history fighting a 9.8 meter per second squared acceleration toward planetary surfaces, she smiled. Zero gravity isn't hostile, it's liberating. Keith had been silent for several minutes, his membranes cycling through colors that suggested intense cognitive processing. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its condescension. How many humans have this training? Depends on what you count as training. Formal athletics, maybe 5% of the population at competitive levels. But if you include anyone who's ever climbed a tree, jumped off a diving board, done a cartwheel, ridden a bicycle, activities that teach balance, rotation, momentum control, you're looking at most of the species. We teach children these skills. We consider them basic physical literacy. Basic, the Celtic repeated faintly. We have entire professions built around it, Rebecca continued. Stunt performers, dancers, athletes, rescue personnel, people who have spent years mastering movement in gravity's presence. She smiled, and this time it wasn't small or knowing. It was genuinely amused. You want to know the really funny part? There's a funny part, the HFY asked weakly. Most humans in space programs wash out of training for psychological reasons, not physical ones. The body adapts fine. It's the brain that struggles, the part that evolved to expect gravity and panics when it's gone. But give us a few days to convince our minds that everything is fine, and the body remembers every lesson gravity ever taught it. She pushed off gently, executing a slow backflip that would have required explosive leg strength in gravity. Here, it took almost no effort. Except now, there's no gravitational penalty for mistakes. No penalty, Keith said slowly. You mean in zero gravity, all those activities become easier, safer, more forgiving? Rebecca nodded. Every human who's ever jumped off a high dive, landed a skateboard trick, or caught themselves from falling has trained for this. They just didn't know it. The Quinn's display had frozen on an image of a human gymnast, suspended mid-rotation, body perfectly controlled in the split second between apparatus and gravity's reclaim. Instructor, they said quietly, I believe we owe Coordinator Webb an apology. Keith's membranes had settled into a dull, uniform color. For what specifically? For assuming incompetence based on incomplete data. For confusing lack of evolutionary adaptation with lack of capability. For not asking what humans do before asking what humans are. You couldn't have known, Rebecca said, her tone generous. We should have asked, the Quinn insisted. That's basic research methodology. Instead, we saw a species that evolved on high-gravity planets and assumed they'd be helpless elsewhere. We never considered they might have spent millennia accidentally preparing for exactly those conditions. Rebecca drifted back to the beverage dispenser, this time executing a triple rotation just because she could. If it helps, you're not the first to make that mistake. Probably won't be the last. Does it happen often? The HFY asked. Other species underestimating humans. Often enough that we've stopped correcting people up front. It's easier to let them discover it themselves. Keith's translator emitted something that might have been a bitter laugh. A species of sandbaggers. Wonderful. We prefer patient educators, Rebecca said. But she was smiling when she said it. 6 months in space changes people, regardless of species. The cargo freighter merchant's dividend wasn't glamorous, but it paid consistently and asked few questions about its crew's certifications. Mixed species operations meant cultural friction, occasional misunderstandings, and a rotation schedule nobody liked but everyone tolerated. It also meant when the micrometeor punctured Bay 7 at 0340 station time, there were 4 different respiratory systems trying to reach emergency equipment in rapidly thinning atmosphere. The gravity plating failed first. It always did when hull integrity compromised, safety feature, supposedly, to prevent electrical fires in damaged sections. Keith had been in Bay 7 checking manifest logs. One moment he was anchored to a workstation. The next he was tumbling through suddenly pressureless space, his membranes already sealing against vacuum exposure. His species could survive brief decompression, but surviving and functioning were entirely separate concepts. His limbs flailed, seeking purchase on surfaces that were no longer where his spatial memory insisted they should be. Panic tastes the same across species, metallic, electric, absolute. The emergency bulkheads would seal in 90 seconds. Anything still in Bay 7 when they closed would stay there until someone suited up for retrieval, assuming there was anything left to retrieve. Keith spun, disoriented, his carefully trained zero-gravity instincts dissolving under adrenaline and the peculiar terror of uncontrolled decompression. He'd taught certification courses. He knew the protocols. His body had simply decided it preferred screaming to following them. Then something caught his dorsal limb, Firm grip, controlled pressure. Rebecca arrested his spin with one hand while her other secured a tether to his equipment harness. She wasn't wearing a vacuum suit. She'd come from crew quarters, still in sleep clothes, with nothing but an emergency breather mask that covered her mouth and nose. Her eyes were already bloodshot from pressure loss, her exposed skin reddening, but her hands were steady. She pointed toward the emergency exit. Keith nodded, the only communication possible without translators in vacuum. Rebecca launched them both in a trajectory that looked random but threaded perfectly between floating cargo containers and debris. Halfway there, a secondary decompression blew a storage panel into their path. Rebecca twisted, her spine rotating them 60 degrees, and Keith felt the panel rush past close enough to register its thermal signature. She'd calculated that dodge while moving, compensating for both their masses, without slowing. 2 other crew members were still in the bay, the HFY tangled in loose cargo netting, and a Feltic whose fronds had instinctively clenched into a protective ball. 2 more humans moved through the chaos like they'd choreographed it. One cut the HFY free while managing their own trajectory with subtle weight shifts. The other reached the Feltic, assessed their panic-frozen state, and simply tucked them under one arm like cargo before pushing off toward the exit. No communication, no coordination signals. They just moved, each human somehow tracking the other's positions and adapting their paths in real time. Rebecca reached the bulkhead threshold with Keith 10 seconds before it sealed. She shoved him through into pressurized atmosphere, then turned back. The other humans were coming in hot, one carrying the Feltic, one towing the HFY. Rebecca caught them both, absorbing momentum that should have slammed them into the far wall, redistributing force through some technique Keith's eyes registered but his brain couldn't parse. The bulkhead screamed shut. Emergency lights strobed. Atmosphere hissed back into the corridor from reserve tanks. Keith's translator reconnected with station systems. The first sound it processed was someone's laughter, not hysterical, just relieved. One of the other humans, checking the Feltic for injuries, was actually chuckling. "Everyone intact?" Rebecca asked, pulling off her breather mask. Her voice was rough from vacuum exposure but calm, clinical even. The HFY uncoiled shakily. "Intact, traumatized but intact." "Trauma we can work with. Medical, anyone need immediate attention." Keith's translator struggled to find appropriate words. His training suggested formal crisis protocols, damage reports, injury assessments, investigation procedures. His brain, still flooded with adrenaline and survival chemicals, only managed, "How?" Rebecca glanced at him, confused. "How what?" "That, all of that. We were in uncontrolled decompression. Debris, tumbling cargo, 90 seconds before bulkhead seal. You moved like you knew exactly where everything would be." "Training," Rebecca said simply, then registered his expression. "Lots of training." The human who'd carried the Feltic was doing stretches against the corridor wall, casual as if they'd just finished routine exercise. Controlled chaos is still controlled if you've practiced enough. That wasn't even bad compared to storm rescue scenarios. "Storm rescue," Keith repeated. "Ocean operations during weather events, way more variables than vacuum. At least space doesn't have waves." The third human nodded agreement. "Or rip currents, or sharks if you're unlucky." "Sharks," the HFY said weakly. "What's a shark?" "Large aquatic predator, not relevant right now." Rebecca helped Keith orient himself properly against the wall. "You good, instructor. You're looking pale, well paler. Your membranes are doing something I haven't seen before." "Shock," Keith managed. "Possibly existential crisis." "That's fair, first decompression." "Second, the first time I followed emergency procedures. This time I panicked like a juvenile." "Panic is normal. Brains aren't rational during life-threatening emergencies. They revert to instinct, and instinct doesn't care about training protocols. Rebecca checked her own hands, flexing fingers that were returning to normal color as circulation restored. What matters is everyone got out. Keith looked at her with an expression that transcended species barriers, the universal look of someone whose worldview had been thoroughly revised against their will. "Question," he said finally. "Sure. After certification, after our conversations about human recreation and gravity training, did you expect something like this to happen?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. Not specifically, but emergencies are common enough in space work. We prepare for categories of crisis, not specific scenarios. And the preparation involves everything we talked about: spatial awareness, momentum control, rapid trajectory calculation, comfort in three-dimensional environments. She smiled, that same small smile from the training module 6 months ago. Also, staying calm when your environment is actively trying to kill you. Humans are good at that part. Because space is honest about it, Keith said quietly, remembering. Exactly. No ambiguity in vacuum. It's hostile, you know it's hostile, so you treat it with appropriate respect and move accordingly. Gravity pretends to be stable, then drops you off cliffs. Vacuum is at least transparent about its intentions. The corridor had returned to normal atmospheric pressure. Emergency lighting had switched back to standard illumination. In a few hours, this would be paperwork and maintenance schedules. Right now, it was just a crew catching their breath. "Coordinator Webb," Keith said, his voice carrying something new, something that might have been respect. "Yes, instructor. I may need to revise the station's zero-gravity certification curriculum, update the training materials, adjust the evaluation criteria." He hesitated, his translator parsing complex chemical signals into something approaching humility. "Would you be willing to consult on human techniques for the manual?" Rebecca's smile widened slightly. "I'd be happy to help. Fair warning, though, most human zero-gravity training is experiential, hard to reduce to manual format." "We'll adapt." Keith's membranes had settled into a color suggesting acceptance of new information. "Clearly, our current methods have significant gaps." "Where would you want to start?" Keith thought about cargo bays and spinning debris, and humans moving through vacuum without suits like it was a recreational activity. He thought about playgrounds and diving pools and activities designed to teach children how to fall with style. "The beginning," he said finally. "Assume I know nothing about human preparation methods. Teach me like I'm a juvenile learning basic concepts." Rebecca nodded slowly. "We can do that, might take some time though. Human movement training is cumulative, years of foundation work." "I have time." Keith's translator emitted something that might have been a laugh, bitter, exhausted but genuine. "You mentioned playgrounds once, something about swings being a good introduction." "They are, teaches pendulum motion, momentum generation, dismount timing, all useful skills." "Then that's where we start. Explain to me, in detail, why your species teaches its children to launch themselves off moving equipment." Rebecca's expression suggested she knew exactly how this lesson would end, with the instructor recognizing that humans had been preparing for space since before they knew space existed. But she was too professional to say it out loud. Instead, she just smiled and said, "Let me tell you about recess." 3 weeks later, Keith stood before a new group of trainees in the certification module. His membrane coloration was lighter than usual, suggesting something his species didn't often experience: uncertainty tempered with genuine curiosity. "Before we begin," he announced, "I want to acknowledge something. I have taught this certification course for 12 standard years. In that time, I have evaluated over 4,000 trainees across 117 species, and I have learned something important. The trainees, a mix of familiar and exotic physiologies, watched him with the universal wariness of students sensing an instructor who'd recently experienced a revelation. "I have learned," Keith continued, "that evolutionary adaptation is only one form of preparation. Some species evolved in environments that naturally prepared them for void work. Others," he paused, and if his anatomy had allowed it, he might have smiled, "others invented playgrounds." A human trainee near the back, a young woman named Lieutenant Jessica Grant, raised her hand slightly. "Instructor, I'm not sure I understand." "You will," Keith assured her. "By the end of this course, you will understand exactly why your species' inexplicable fondness for throwing yourselves off elevated surfaces has made you some of the most naturally competent void workers in Federation space." The other trainees exchanged confused glances. "Now," Keith said, his tone shifting to professional instruction mode, "today we will begin with fundamental momentum transfer. But first, I want each of you to tell me, what was your favorite childhood game that involved rotation, height, or calculated risk?" Lieutenant Grant's hand went up immediately. "Tire swing over the creek behind my house. My brothers and I used to see who could jump farthest before hitting the water." "Excellent," Keith said, and he meant it. "Tell me about the physics of your jump timing. How did you calculate release point to maximize distance?" As the trainee began explaining, describing instinctive understanding of pendulum dynamics, momentum conservation, and trajectory calculation that she'd learned at age 8, Keith's membranes rippled with something very much like satisfaction. He'd spent 6 months reviewing human recreational activities, studying everything from jungle gyms to extreme sports. He'd watched thousands of hours of footage showing humans of all ages engaging in activities that seemed designed to cause injury but somehow taught profound lessons about physics, spatial awareness, and risk management. And he'd come to understand something fundamental. Humans didn't train for space. They played their way into excellence, one playground at a time, one childhood game at a time, one recreational activity at a time. They taught their children to fall with grace, to spin with control, to understand their bodies as tools capable of remarkable things. And when those children grew up and went to space, they discovered that every game of tag, every rope swing, every cartwheel and handstand and diving board jump had been preparing them for an environment that wouldn't exist for thousands of years. It was, Keith had to admit, perhaps the most human thing imaginable, to accidentally prepare for the future while playing in the present. "All right," he announced, once Lieutenant Grant had finished her explanation. "Let's begin. And remember, if you learn to navigate a playground, you can navigate the void. The principles are identical. The void is just more forgiving about mistakes." The human trainee smiled at that, recognizing the truth in his words. The non-human trainees looked faintly disturbed, still processing the idea that an entire species had spent millennia accidentally training for space work through the simple act of play. Keith watched them all, his membranes settling into a color that suggested deep contentment. He'd been humbled, educated, and fundamentally changed by his interactions with humans. His assumptions had been shattered. His prejudices had been exposed and discarded. And in their place, he'd gained something far more valuable: understanding. "One more thing," he said, addressing the group. "At the end of this certification, I expect each of you to pass the course on your own merits, but I also expect you to learn something beyond technical competency. I expect you to learn humility." He paused, letting his eye stalk sweep across the assembled trainees. "Because the moment you assume you understand another species' capabilities based solely on their evolutionary history, you've already failed the most important test. The universe is full of surprises, and sometimes," his gaze settled briefly on Lieutenant Grant, "the species that evolved to walk on solid ground becomes the one most at home among the stars." The training began. And somewhere in the depths of space, on a cargo freighter still bearing the scars of emergency repairs, Coordinator Rebecca Webb received a message from Keith. It was brief, formal, and carried an attachment. The revised Federation Zero Gravity Certification Manual, now featuring an entire new section on human recreational training methods and their applications to void work. The dedication page read simply, "To Coordinator Webb, who taught me that the best teachers are often the ones who never intended to teach at all. Humanity's gift to the void is not technology or strength. It is the simple, profound understanding that play is the most serious form of preparation." Rebecca smiled, saved the file, and forwarded it to her brother back on Earth with a simple note. "Remember how Mom said all those hours at the climbing gym were a waste of time? Turns out she was wrong. Also, tell the kids their skateboarding might actually be job training. We're raising the next generation of void workers, one scraped knee at a time." Then she pushed off from her workstation and executed a perfect triple rotation through the corridor, just because she could. Just because humans had been practicing exactly this move on diving boards and trampolines and playgrounds for centuries, long before they knew the stars were waiting. Just because play, joyful, reckless, gravity-defying play, had been preparing them all along. And